accomplish the task, he sent out an email to David and I to say he'd been approved by the faculty at LBU. And I noticed Dave's, I think I got a copy of Dave's, all of us were saying, praise the Lord.
Yeah.
Dave actually worked more with Steve than I did. Steve has, of course, been in all the classes that I taught, all the classes that David taught. But David is an excellent writer, has several books out, writing for other combination of authors who are putting books on different subjects. One on dispensationalism, right?
Yeah, we just finished 5 chapters, a book that's coming out for the lay level, 25 different authors. Just published.
Great. So you'll want to be looking at that. We'll notify you about it. But Dave has been assisting any way he could Steve to help edit in preliminary activities as he was approved to do that subject and then be involved in working and finishing up his PhD. A former executive at IBM up in Connecticut. Just a lovely family. I've already introduced them to you. At least a portion of the family. There are more. But Steve, we're looking forward to what you're going to say, and I think an excellent subject you did your dissertation. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Jimmy, and I'm just honored and humbled to be before you today. And I guess I promised my 2 buddies from the Israel trip that I'd wave at them. They're online today, Randy and Ron, and I want to encourage them and encourage all of you. If I could do it, you could do it. I was a Presbyterian for 57 years. So if I can do it, you can do it. I was a computer guy. Yeah, I know executive sounds great, but I was just a computer dweeb, and through that crazy time in that industry, so what I'm going to talk about today is a different look, I think. I looked all over for if there's anything published about this, and couldn't find anything but some little bits and pieces. So the title of my dissertation is From the First Marriage to the Last, Marriage in Bible Prophecy. And so I'm going to give you a little introduction. How did I get there? Why in the world did I choose that topic? And because when I first looked, I said, can I get 150 pages out of this? And then I'm going to talk about some notable marriages in the Bible. You have an outline of the dissertation, which is really very compressed to show you all the areas I covered. But I'm going to hit some of the high point ones to talk about with you. And then we'll talk about the greatest marriage, the marriage of the Lamb. That'll be like the 3rd section. And then the 4th will be a wrap-up, a conclusion, and talk about one of my favorite topics, the 4 pillars of a godly marriage, because God told us what that would be in Genesis, and I try to pull the whole thing together. I really never wanted to get a PhD or even a master's. I wanted to learn more about Bible prophecy. We were blessed to, in 1995, join a church in Hawthorne, New Jersey, where the pastor was from Dallas, trained at Dallas, but he preached prophecy. And that was awesome. I mean, he preached Ezekiel. I've never heard Ezekiel preach in any other church. But he preached Ezekiel, he preached Daniel, he preached Revelation, he preached end times, Thessalonians. And I got really interested in prophecy because, like I think a lot of people, where's the world going? How are things going to turn out? And then I retired December 31 of 2010. And that summer of 2011, went up to Word of Life in Schroon Lake, because we lived in New York at the time, about 4 hours from Schroon Lake, and went up there every summer for years. And that summer, Jimmy DeYoung was speaking. And at the end of his week, he talked about he was starting a school of prophets. And I said, oh, wow, that sounds great. And so I signed up, and I went to Gatlinburg, was the first session, and started in. And the more I studied, and the more I liked it, the more I enjoyed it, the more I got out of it. And I said, well, maybe I'll do that master's thing. I had an MBA, and the reason I went to MBA as a master's in college was there was no thesis required. So here I am looking at 100 pages, going to a 100-page thesis. How could I do that? But anyway, I kept going and did the thesis. And through that process, saw that I was one looking at the scope of prophecy. In fact, I begged Dr. DeYoung, could I take his trio of triplets, you know, where the three parts of the family come from? It's in an introduction to Ezekiel, and when he gives his prophecy talks, he starts by introducing the three peoples, the three prophets, the three predictions. And I wanted to explode that into a whole thing, and he said, great, go for it. And David helped me edit it so that then I published it afterwards. So it's on Amazon, it's on Jimmy's list. It's called Warning in the Elevator, a 3D view of Bible prophecy. And so that's what we are, is that we're watchmen. I saw that Dr. Jimmy wrote in David's book, the introduction, that he's a watchman. We're all watchmen to alert the people to what's coming, and that's what we're to do in Bible prophecy. And so when I came to the doctoral part, actually all I wanted to do was go to Israel. And my wife and I had that on our bucket list for years, and we said, oh great, we'll go on a prophecy trip. I had no plan to go further than that. And I think that's probably about as far as I want to go. But of course, you hang around with Dr. Jimmy for 3 weeks. We were done. Ron and Randy and I, by the time of that end, we said, we're going for our doctorate. So came back and continued the study, and then began to think about, after my thesis was accepted, I got the degree in 2015, and then, well, what would I write a dissertation about? That's got to be 150 pages. I had enough trouble with 100 pages. But something happened in 2012, and that is that I really believe the Lord called my wife and I to a marriage ministry at our church. And we had been the prior 3 years, and that's a whole other story, really studying marriage, reading everything we could find, going to conferences, talking to people, going to classes. We even went to another church that had a marriage group to plug into because the marriage group in our church had gone away. But we felt one day that the Lord had called us to bring that marriage group back to that church. And we called it Great Marriages God's Way. And it was biblically based. And so we began to teach that. When we moved to Florida, we felt the Lord led us to a church that had no marriage ministry, and we've started one there. And we call that one Great Marriages God's Way South. So I thought, is there a way of putting these two passions together, marriage and prophecy? And I realized the more that we had studied prophecy and as we had gone through it, that God uses the metaphor of marriage a lot in the Bible and in Bible prophecy. And from Adam and Eve, and the generations then would come to Christ and on, that would lead to Christ, marriage to the church. And God talks often of his people Israel and how he wants them to be his bride. And so really the metaphor of marriage lays out how God wants to have relationships with his people. And it points, the metaphor points to the eternal relationship of God with creation and onto the rule of Christ. And so you'll see the abstract in the handout there with the outline. But let me read you a quote. One of my favorite marriage teachers is a gentleman by the name of Paul David Tripp. And he wrote this great marriage book, and he titled it, What Did You Expect? And think about that as a great marriage. What did you expect in your marriage? And the part I really like is I never expected him to talk about what he ended up talking about. So let me read a quote from him about marriage in the Bible. He said, "We mistakenly treat the Bible as if it were arranged by topic. You know, the world's best compendium of human problems and divine solutions. So when we're thinking about marriage, we run to all the marriage passages. But the Bible isn't an encyclopedia, it's a story, the great origin to destination story of redemption. And in fact, it is more than a story. It is a theologically annotated story. It is a story with God's notes. This means we cannot understand what the Bible has to say about marriage by looking only at the marriage passages, because there are a vast amount of biblical information about marriage not found in the marriage passages. In fact, we could argue to the degree that every portion of the Bible tells us things about God, about ourselves, about life in this present world, and about the nature of the human struggle and the divine solution, to the degree that every passage in the Bible is a marriage passage. That kind of rang with me a little bit. Prophecy, we think almost every passage in the Bible has some prophecy aspects to it and has a marriage aspect too. Every passage imparts to us insight that is vital for a proper understanding of the passages that directly address marriage, and every passage tells us what we should expect as we deal with the comprehensive relationship of marriage. And so that's what I started studying. For a year, well, actually I wrote the outline in April. I began writing the outline in April of 2017. That took me about 2 months. The advice I would give is take some time and really get a good outline, because that really helped me write it then, to go through. And I kept, every time I would hear a sermon or read one of Dr. Jimmy's daily letters that would touch on marriage, I'd throw it in a folder, either a paper folder, if it's paper, or an electronic folder. And I had a stack like this. And from there, I developed the outline and I decided to do it as I had done the other book, start in Genesis with Adam and Eve and go all the way to the end. The marriage, the wedding of the Lamb, and the reign of Christ with his bride. Now the word marriage doesn't appear that many times in the Bible. In the King James, 19 times, in the New King James, 17 times. Adultery, 40 times, bride, 14, bridegroom, 23. In the King James, divorce only once, although in the New King James, 16 times. So not a whole lot, yet as you think about the Bible, as we go through some of the marriages here, as you look at that outline, there are marriages all over. There's marriages all over the Bible. And so what I'd like to do is go through then some of the notable marriages and their metaphors and their relations. And we start with Adam and Eve in Genesis 2, the first marriage. You know, I find it interesting that Satan didn't attack Adam, did he? He didn't attack Adam till he was married. And since then, he's been continuing to attack marriages all through history. Noah's married. We don't know Noah's wife's name, but she went along. God told Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply. Be fruitful and multiply, and that's a common theme throughout the Bible. What did he tell Noah when they landed and Noah came out? He said the same thing. Be fruitful and multiply. Be fruitful and multiply. Be productive and multiply. Go out and populate the world. And even though Noah's grandson tried to stop that, God made it happen anyway. He confounded the languages and everybody, and spread them around the world. The marriage of Isaac, the search for a bride for Isaac, the bride of Jacob. And we see here elements of the Jewish wedding model, the betrothal, the bride price, that we'll come to later when we get to the bride of the Lamb. The troubles of polygamy penetrate through the Pentateuch. I get a lot of questions. People, well, if God said one man, one woman, how come in the Old Testament there was so much polygamy? Good question. But God allowed it, and he allowed it for several reasons. it was an agrarian economy, and if the first wife didn't have children, then God allowed the man to take another wife so he could have children, so he could be fruitful and multiply, to follow God's commandment. So all through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all through Genesis, you see this, Abraham had multiple wives, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob had a bunch. And then there was also the levirate marriage. I tease my friends, not only do you need to know Greek and Hebrew, you need to know Latin, because levirate is actually a Latin word. And in the agrarian economy, if a wife died, or if the husband died, if the husband died and you had a widow, the widow could remarry. In fact, was encouraged to remarry, and to a brother, if they existed, of the man who had died. And that was called the levirate marriage, and that means brotherhood, a brother. And we'll see this as we go to really the next marriage, which is my favorite one, and that's Ruth. And that's Ruth and Boaz. 3 of the 5 women in the genealogy of Christ happen in 4 generations. Rahab, the prostitute at Jericho, was saved by the spies, lived outside the camp, married, and came to the Lord, and had a child. And his name was Boaz. And then in the story of Ruth, that's a great story. It starts with 3 funerals, right? Naomi's husband and her 2 sons die. But it ends with a wedding of Ruth and Boaz and a child. And Ruth and Boaz were the great-grandparents of David. So you had Rahab, Ruth, and then Bathsheba, the wife of David, whose 2 sons, Solomon and Nathan, lead to the genealogies to Christ. So Matthew 1, the genealogy through Solomon. Luke 3, the genealogy through Nathan. So I love reading those genealogies, Dr. Jimmy. There's really a lot of information in there. So Ruth and Boaz had Obed, who had Jesse, who had David. So and there were 2 Jewish laws that applied to the marriage of Ruth and Boaz. One was the levirate marriage. Ruth's husband has died, and so when she came back to the Promised Land with Naomi, Naomi was looking for a spouse for Ruth, and there was a kinsman, another relative. There weren't any other brothers. Naomi's husband didn't have any other brothers, but there was another relative that could marry. In fact, there were several, at least 2 the Bible talks about. And so the levirate marriage was described in Deuteronomy 25, 5-20. You can read about that and how that all worked. And then the other Jewish law was the kinsman redeemer, that a kinsman could redeem the estate of the dead husband and care, and by marrying the widow, be able to care for the widow and to continue the name of the family. As we remember the story, Boaz was a kinsman. He had fields. Ruth came, and he let her in, and he when she asks him why he's been so nice to her, why Boaz is nice to her, he says that because of her kindness to Naomi. And it's really interesting because Rahab uses the same words to describe the kindness of the spies that saved her and her family. You almost wonder, did Boaz hear his mother talking about that and leave that thought in his mind to show kindness to those who show kindness to us? Because that's what he did with Ruth. And then they married, and he stood up and said that he would redeem the debts. So apparently either Ruth's husband or Naomi's husband had some debts that had to be paid off. The other kinsman, when he realized there was another woman involved, as you recall, said, well, I don't think I want to do that. But Boaz kind of set him up real well, because I think Boaz seemed really interested in Ruth, and so they went ahead with that. And then the whole town was excited when then she was going to have a child, and had a child, and that child led to Jesse and to David, the prince that we talked about. There's the next set of marriages has to do with David. Are really interesting, and I call this section David and the Princess. When David shows up in the Valley of Elah, and it's interesting, I have a picture of us with David James in the Valley of Elah, and I always show that to people. That's where David and Goliath fought. And when David arrived, as you recall the story, with food for his brothers, he heard Goliath come out. And he, what is this? So, he got pretty upset about it, and the attitude Goliath had toward the God of Israel, and so he turned to some of the men and said, well, what will the person that kills this pagan receive? And they said, well, he'll be very wealthy, he'll get to marry the daughter of the king, and his father's estate will be tax-free. Wow. Okay, that kind of puts a different twist on the story, I think, because several verses later, so that was let's see, that was verse 25. In verse 27, David asks again, and they tell him the same thing. And again, 3 verses after that, in verse 30, he asks again. They tell him the same thing. Wealth, the princess, tax-free to your father. So then he says, okay, how do I do it? And he goes to Saul and he signs up. And as we know, kills Goliath. And he had already been anointed. That's another marriage, right? Hannah, the mother of Samuel. A lot of barren wives along the way. I mean, Sarah, Rebecca, Hannah, Elizabeth, the father of John the Baptist. But God had plans, and they all bore children. And so David had been anointed prior to this, and then, as we know the story, Saul chases him around a while. Now, Saul never did give his first daughter to David. David, on second thought, wasn't so sure, so he gave away his first daughter. But when Saul found out his second daughter, Michal, loved David, he said, "Okay, you can have her." And maybe that was part of God's plan too, because she saved him when Saul was trying to kill him, as you recall that story as well. And then we have so then David took quite a number of wives along the way. Abigail, that's a great story. And then some other wives, but found that the same kinds of issues that Jacob, for instance, had with too many wives and too many kids and discord and dysfunction, and that affected their lives, affected David's life. Solomon had too many wives, 700 wives, 300 concubines, And in Deuteronomy, there were rules for kings, and that they were to write down their own, what some call a rule of life, and read it every day. And they weren't to collect too much gold and silver. They weren't to collect horses, because that might lead to warfare. And they weren't to have too many wives. But Solomon, over time, seemed to ignore all that. And eventually it was the pagan wives that led Solomon astray and caused him to lose his kingship, although God was true and had promised the throne to David, and so continued on. Another great marriage is Esther. The book of Esther is a fascinating book. It doesn't mention God, but it has the message that God is true to his promises. Dr. Jimmy talks about because when God has fulfilled promises, we know that we can trust him to fulfill the promises to us. And so God promised to protect his people. And in the story of Esther, the king is looking for a new wife after his other one disappointed him. And so he has a contest, and Esther is chosen. He doesn't realize she's Jewish. But then Haman, the Amalekite, decides to wipe out the Jews because Mordecai, Esther's uncle, didn't show him proper respect in the town square. And so Mordecai learns of this and gets to Esther and says, hey, you got to get the king to do something, to turn this thing around. And one of the great lines in the Bible that Esther's hesitant, not sure how the king will react. And Mordecai says, possibly God has put you there for a time like this. And so she does. She works out an idea and eventually gets Haman, traps Haman, and the hanging tree that was meant for Mordecai is used on Haman, and the Jews are saved. In much of the prophets, the books of the prophets, God uses a lot this metaphor of marriage, how Israel has committed adultery with other gods, how Israel has been unfaithful. And in Isaiah, God's love is mentioned 5 times in a marital way. Jeremiah 12 times. Hosea is all about the prodigal wife, and the metaphor of the betrayal of the wife, and God's searching to return the relationship that he had designed at the beginning, the personal relationship of a marriage. In the New Testament, the marriage of Joseph and Mary, the prophecy's fulfilled. That prophecy's fulfilled. The genealogies come to them. Jesus is born. And then through the Gospels, Jesus talks a lot about marriage. And he talks about the times that are coming, that will come, are like, and Dr. Jimmy mentioned the other, like the days of Lot and the days of Noah. And in the Bible it says in those days they were marrying, they were having children, they were doing all the normal things, and then in the case of the flood, suddenly they were all taken away. All those marriages ended, and a whole new line of marriages had to begin. In the day of Lot, the Sodom and Gomorrah were leveled. And one of the great stories, another great marriage story, or maybe not marriage story, the incest of Lot, whose 2 sons were Moab and Ammon, 2 of the tribes that would one day fight against the Jews. Jesus also his first miracle was at a wedding at Cana, where he turned the water into wine. And why? So that his disciples might believe. He used the vehicle of a wedding. The woman at the well had been married 5 times. And Jesus almost seemed to go out of his way to go through Samaria back to Galilee so that he could stop at this well and meet the Samaritan woman. And you have quite a little exchange there. But basically, she found that through marriage to men, she wasn't able to meet her needs, but only through the living water and through Christ could she be saved. And so that's a great story too. Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians and the Ephesians, talks a lot about marriage. He gets into one of the very controversial areas of marriage, the word submission. And I know over the years we've had a lot of discussions in marriage groups and with couples about submission of the wife. But the word, when you look at the Greek word, it merely means to arrange oneself, to arrange one in an orderly way. And as the husband is to arrange himself under Christ, then the wife is to arrange herself under the husband. And in fact, it is the section about submission that leads into Ephesians 5:32, where Paul reveals the mystery of, he says, I'm not talking about marriage, I'm talking about Christ and the church. I'm talking about the wedding of Christ and the church. That mystery that had not been revealed till that time. Now the third section then of the dissertation has to do with the wedding of the Lamb, and this follows the Jewish wedding model, the betrothal, where they're engaged to be married for at least around a year, to make sure that the bride is a virgin. And during that time, the bridegroom prepares. Remember, Jesus says in John 14:3, I'm going away to prepare a place for you. And so that's what the Jewish young man would do. He would go away and prepare a place, often an addition on his father's home. And the bride would prepare. She had a gown to prepare. She had other aspects of the wedding. And the metaphor is the bride, the church has that time of being righteous, to be able to create the righteous gown in which she'll be married. The bridegroom protects the bride in Revelation 3:10, 1 Thessalonians 1:10 and 5:9, where Jesus says he'll protect his bride from the wrath to come. Then Jesus comes for his bride, the rapture. In the Jewish wedding model, the father sends his son for the bride, and here God will send his son for his bride. And the bride comes, meeting the bridegroom in the air, and comes to heaven for final sanctification. And then the marriage, the wedding, that's predicted in Daniel, and it is described in Revelation 19. The bridegroom comes, and in the Jewish wedding model, the wedding feast lasted for 7 days. And in the marriage of the Lamb, as the 7 days or the 70th week of Daniel will last for 7 years, the Bible points to that the wedding feast of the Lamb will last for that 7-year period. At the end of that, Jesus returns with his bride in Revelation 19 and rules with his bride through the millennium. And Jesus is the judge at the great white throne judgment, and then he rules with his bride in eternity. The fourth section then of the paper is what I call the 4 pillars of a Christian marriage. And in Genesis 2:24 to 25, this is what was written. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. So let's just trace those through. The first part, therefore shall a man leave his father and mother. That I call a vocation. A vocation is a work. A vocation is a priority. The priority of marriage is the marriage. Next to the relationship to God and Christ, the most important relationship is the relationship of marriage. And shall cleave unto his wife. That's the covenant. And like the Abrahamic covenant, it's unconditional and it's eternal. And they shall be one flesh. They will be fruitful. They'll have children. And they'll bless the earth. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. And that's openness and vulnerability and transparency. And those are the four aspects that the Bible says and that we've learned, Jan and I, through our marriage ministry, is that marriage should be a priority. It should be a commitment, an eternal commitment. It should be fruitful to the degree that the couple can, but fruitful, maybe even spiritually fruitful through their working together, leading out of marriage, serving out of a marriage, and that they are transparent. They're open, they're transparent, and they share, and each knows everything about each other. So in closing, Ernie Haas and Signature Sound, I think some of you know that musical group. It's one of our favorite Christians group. They were performing in February this year at the Baalbek Center at Word of Life in Hudson, Florida. And they sang a song with a question of hope and eternal joy. I'm not going to sing, don't worry. I saw some faces there, easy. But I'm going to read the words. I'm going to read the words and see what you think. Is that wedding music that I hear? The bride's adorned and ready to appear. There's heavenly preparation for the wedding celebration. Is that wedding music that I hear? The family is preparing for a wedding. All have been invited to attend. The bride is standing ready, waiting for the signal when the groom says, "Rise, my children, come on in." Is that wedding music that I hear? The bride's adorned and ready to appear. There's heavenly preparation for the wedding celebration. Is that wedding music that I hear? Soon we'll rise to leave this land of sorrow for that ceremony in the air. The Father then will lead us through the holy land of splendor. Have you made your preparation to go there? There's heavenly preparation for the wedding celebration. Is that wedding music? Oh, is that wedding music that I hear? And I end my dissertation with these three statements. Do you hear wedding music? Are you ready for the wedding of the Lamb? And then I close like Dr. Jimmy always closes. Maranatha, come Lord Jesus. Thank you. Q&A, a few minutes.
Thank you for the presentation, number one. Great reminder of what we've all read before, but it's just so key how marriage is. And let me also thank you for not singing that song. But having said that, interesting, I've always, and maybe I understood it and I always wondered how the Lord would overlook how even great men of God would have a number of different wives based upon the principles of Genesis chapter 2. Now, could you go just a little bit deeper? As I understood, because a man would be married to a wife, they could not have children. He was then allowed. Can you give us any more insight?
Yeah. It's in Deuteronomy. If the first wife couldn't have children, like in it,
What passage? Do you have that down?
I don't have that down.
Okay.
I don't have it right here. I'm sorry, and I forgot. Just kind of left my brain. Maybe Dave could look it up quick. So if then the man could remarry. For instance, Hannah was the first wife, but she couldn't have children. So then Samuel's father, Elkanah, I think, could remarry and had a second wife, and then she pestered Hannah, and then Hannah prayed to the Lord for a child, and so on.
So it had to be within the framework of the passage in Deuteronomy.
Oh, yeah.
And then.
Well, and then the levirate marriage, the marriage of widows. Now Boaz, as far as the Bible said, didn't seem as though he had another wife, but the other kinsman did, it appears, and could have married her, but
So the
chose not to.
Redeemer would allow
Right.
those already married to be the kinsman redeemer.
Right. Right. That's right. Yeah.
Anybody else have a question?
Anyway, the verses where that is in my book. Will be in my book. Deuteronomy 17? Okay.
Deuteronomy 17.
Deuteronomy 17.
Yeah, my search at 25. Is that it?
17:25?
No, chapter 25.
Oh, chapter 25. I'll try chapter 25. Sorry.
That was what they've, wife died without a child, the brother.
Okay.
That's what you're
Yeah.
So what the marriages that are portrayed throughout the Bible, when the principles were broken, consequences followed,
Yeah.
but they were pointing towards the final marriage supper. Is that?
That's yes. Yeah. Yeah.
How do you, when you make a presentation, or when you in the future make a presentation, and your marriage conferences here in January, how do you deal with the divorce issue inside of those people that may be there? How do you?
That's a good question. In fact, we were talking about that at dinner, that the divorce rate within the church is about the same as the secular world. In fact, the real interesting thing in our classes is the number of people that have been divorced that come to the class. And they basically say, I goofed it up the first time, I don't want to goof it up again, and I realized that I didn't do the marriage the way God wanted to. How did God want it to be? I mean, we had a couple in New Jersey. They had both divorced, and they were, and they wanted to get married, but they didn't because they were afraid. And we have two couples in our class in Florida. Both married, divorced, remarried, and the thing is that they realized that they violated almost all of God's commands and commandments, and they had maybe addictions, sexual pornography comes into it, and the other thing we look at is we go back in their genealogy, what's called a genogram. One exercise we do is we have people look back at their families of origin. Because remember what the Bible says, the sins of the father will be taken down through 3 generations. And you look at Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I go, whoa, they lied, they had favorites. A lot of those characteristics continue on. And we preach, in the new family of Jesus, you can change. You can stop that and start a new generation. In Tanzania, we talked to preachers, and they were all like, oh my gosh, you've got to stop what you're doing and the new family of Jesus continue on. And many of the folks, when you do this genogram, you find generations of divorce, generations of alcoholism, generations of addictions, generations of adultery. And they realize that they need to break that. They need to break that.
I always, when I'm in a church or wherever I'm speaking, I introduce Judy and I say that we're celebrating our next wedding celebration date. Judy and I would have been married for 60 years, and I say, I always brag about that.
Mhm.
I want them to understand it's a very important
Yeah.
principle, the Word of God. And then I tell them I've only had one argument. Judy and I have only had one argument during that 59 years. Started September 1959, and it's continued for the 59 years. My point being, though, are you finding it, isn't it exciting to go into a church because of the divorce rate in the church and teach these principles?
Oh, yeah.
To then be able to see, hey, if you follow the book, I mean, this what God
Absolutely.
wants. Here's the way to defeat divorce before it comes into you.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, no question about it. And it's a fantastic feeling to couples say to us, 2 and 3 years later, you saved my marriage, and I never would have known what to do, because what school did we go to about marriage? We didn't. The only school we had was our family, wasn't it? That's where we learned about marriage. And my family was a tough, half Sicilian, half German, didn't talk, didn't hug. That's a big burden to carry, And but by pointing that out, we say, hey, this is your family of origin. We're going to break this, and we're going to do it God's way. And that, I got a phone call just before we came down here. A couple wants to come from Raleigh, North Carolina, to come meet with us. Talk about their marriage that's fallen apart because of they're a friend of Jan's, and know that we teach this, we mentor, we coach, but that's a big ministry. Now, my next prayer to the Lord is, how do I put prophecy and that together? But we hand out the prophecy books in the marriage class, so I guess that's one thing. Yeah,
That's what's so exciting about it.
it is.
And that's why, as my part, and David as his part, when we heard what you're going to do your dissertation on, we were excited about it, gave you the approval, and it went on up the
Yeah,
line.
yeah.
Now, brother, it's all from here on is uphill.
It's all, yeah, it's all uphill.
Praise the Lord.
Yeah, praise the Lord. Thank you all. Thank you all.